Beneath the streets of Manchester, there are tunnels, buried rivers, and sealed canal passages that have been closed since before anyone alive today was born. Above ground, there are streets that no longer exist, erased so completely that even the people who lived there left no trace. There is also one street where something happened in 1996 that left 200 people injured and caused £700 million of damage in a single morning. We're counting down the 10 weirdest and most forbidden streets in Manchester. Make sure you stay because number 1 is a story the city has been trying to move past for 30 years. Northeast of the city centre sits a district that was once the industrial heart of Manchester and is now one of the most extensively regenerated neighbourhoods in the north of England. Ancoats is where the modern world was invented and the people who built it were treated accordingly. From the late 1700s, steam-powered cotton mills began rising in Ancoats on a scale that had never been seen anywhere on Earth. Some of the earliest factories to run on steam power operated here, and the workers who kept them running lived in cramped back-to-back terraces built by the mill owners in the streets immediately surrounding the factory gates. The housing existed to serve the mills, not the people inside it. By the mid-1800s, a wave of Italian immigrants, most of them from the Lombardy region, had settled in the northwest corner of Ancoats and created an enclave that became known as Little Italy. They built their own church, St. Michael's, which still stands on George Lee Street. They ran their own shops and kept their own language in a self-contained community pressed between walls of Victorian brick and the constant noise of the factory floors surrounding it. The mills eventually closed and the streets were cleared in waves of slum demolition running from the 1930s into the 1970s. The workers' terraces between the mills are largely gone. What was left was a district of empty shells and derelict land until regeneration money arrived in the 2000s. Today you can walk through Ancoats and find restored mill buildings, cafes and apartments. But the original street grid between those mills, the one where the workers actually lived, has been erased. The mills survived, the people's streets didn't. But the streets of Ancoats were at least remembered. Number 9 on this list wasn't even given that much. South of the city centre, there is a stretch of Oxford Road, where nothing visible remains of what stood there for decades. Little Island was a cluster of streets near the River Medlock, running below the river's natural floodline, where Manchester's Irish immigrant population settled from the early 19th century. Friedrich Engels walked through it in the 1840s and wrote about it in the book The Condition of the Working Class in England, describing streets where raw sewage ran openly between the houses, where entire families lived in basement rooms that flooded regularly, and where the air carried a constant stench from the slaughterhouses and dye works operating upstream. In the 1841 census, more than 75% of Little Island's population recorded as Irish. These were people who had fled poverty and famine to find factory work, and what they found were streets built below a river's flood level with no sanitation and almost no natural light. Then in 1845, the Manchester and Altrincham Railway needed to extend its line. 7 of the streets of Little Island were in the way, so they were demolished. No compensation was offered, no alternative housing was arranged. The people were removed and the railway ran through what had been their homes. A single heritage plaque on Great Marlborough Street marks the site now, and Oxford Road above it shows no trace of what was there. The streets are not buried, they were obliterated for a train line, and the city moved on without leaving a marker. At least Little Island is gone entirely. Number 8 is still there, right under the city, moving through the dark. You just cannot see it from the surface. Number 8, the River Irk culvert. Number 8 sits below ground, running directly under one of the busiest transit hubs in northern England. The River Irk flows southward through the northern part of Manchester before meeting the River Irwell near Victoria Station. For most of its visible length, it is a modest river moving through a post-industrial landscape. But near Victoria Station, it disappears. As Manchester grew through the 19th century, the city built on top of the Irk rather than around it. The river was culverted, sealed into a brick-lined tunnel as buildings, roads, and eventually a railway station were constructed directly above it. The culvert runs beneath Victoria Station itself, carrying the river underground through Victorian brickwork that most Mancunians have never seen and probably do not know exists. At the corner of Hunt's Bank and Victoria Street, there is a stone wall. Stand next to it and listen carefully, and you can hear the Irk moving in the dark on the other side. Access to the culvert is restricted to council maintenance workers. Urban explorers who have entered illegally describe brick archways stretching into blackness with the sound of rushing water all around them. The river that shaped Manchester's original settlement now runs sealed beneath a commuter station, completely invisible to the hundreds of thousands of people passing through above it every week. Number 7 involves a different kind of sealed space. This one was not an accident of history, it was a government decision. Number 7, the Picc-Vic tunnel. It is the ghost of a project that very nearly transformed the city forever. In the early 1970s, Manchester City Council developed a plan for an underground rail network connecting Manchester Piccadilly to Manchester Victoria, with a series of underground stations beneath the city centre. They called it the Picc-Vic scheme, contracting the two station names. The plans were detailed, the engineering surveys were complete, and the ambition was entirely serious. Construction began, tunnelling work started, equipment arrived, and sections of the city centre were dug into to start building the line. Manchester was going to have an underground railway. Then came 1977, the economic crisis and the government spending cuts that shut down infrastructure projects across the country. The money stopped and the Picc-Vic scheme was cancelled, with work already under the ground. Those partially excavated sections were sealed and left. They still exist beneath parts of Manchester city centre, infrastructure that was begun and then abandoned in place, too expensive to fill in and too incomplete to use. The Manchester Evening News described it as a scheme where construction had already started before the idea was later scrapped. Above those sealed tunnels, Manchester eventually got the Metrolink tram network in 1992. It was an entirely different system running on the surface, bearing no connection to the half-built underground that remained sealed in the dark below streets that were redeveloped entirely around it. And the canal tunnel at number 6 has been sealed even longer, almost 150 years longer. 3 of the entries remaining on this list involve places you genuinely cannot access. This is the first of them, and it is the oldest. Number 6 is a canal tunnel running under the heart of Manchester city centre, built between 1836 and 1839 to connect the Mersey and Irwell navigation to the Rochdale Canal. The engineers ran most of it underground to move goods through the city without paying the heavy tolls on the other connecting routes. The tunnel was deliberately underground. It was used for 36 years. In 1875, the canal was abandoned because the toll revenue never justified the operating costs, and the tunnel was sealed. The tunnel is nearly a kilometre long and is Grade 2 listed on Historic England's register. As recently as 2024, an investigation by the Manchester Evening News confirmed it was still closed to the public and described it as 185 years old, and once an important route for distributing goods across the city. The listing notes it remains closed to casual access. The structure survives intact underground, passing beneath streets and buildings that have been rebuilt repeatedly above it over 150 years. Specialist urban explorers who have accessed the tunnel describe Victorian brickwork in good condition, the original canal channel still visible, and a silence so complete that sound from the surface does not penetrate. The city moves above it, unaware. The tunnel has not changed since 1875. because there has been no reason for it to. The experience inside is defined by that deep silence. Number 5 is the final sealed underground entry on this list, and it holds a history from the Second World War that most Mancunians have entirely forgotten. On the banks of the River Irwell, a few minutes from the city centre, there is something most people who pass within 100 metres of it have no idea exists. The Victoria Arches are a series of vaulted brick arches built into the Irwell embankment below Bridge Street. They went up in the early 19th century and originally served as business premises and landing stages for steam packet riverboats, moving cargo and passengers along the Irwell. In the age before railways, river traffic was how goods moved through Manchester. That trade died when the railways arrived. The arches were repurposed for storage and small businesses, and for a long stretch of the Victorian era, they were just there, useful for one thing or another. Then came the Second World War, and they became something different entirely. Manchester took sustained bombing from the Luftwaffe. During the Christmas Blitz of December 1940, waves of German bombers hit the city centre over 2 nights. The Victoria Arches were converted into air raid shelters, and the people of Manchester packed into those riverside vaults to wait out the raids happening above them. After the war, the arches were bricked up and sealed. They are on Historic England's Grade 2 listed buildings register and are described by Atlas Obscura as a series of abandoned waterside industrial sites, hidden on the urban banks of a Manchester river. They are accessible only through occasional heritage open days organised by Manchester City Council. For the rest of the year they are closed, and that row of sealed vaults on the riverbank looks like nothing at all. If you are finding these places as fascinating as we are, drop a comment below about which one you would most want to explore. We will keep going. Number 4 is above ground, but the history it carries might be the strangest of any street on this list. Number 4, Great Ducie Street. Great Ducie Street has run through more criminal history, more legal contradiction, and more plain strangeness than almost anywhere else in Manchester. Great Ducie Street runs through the Strangeways area north of the city centre, in the shadow of HMP Manchester, one of the largest and most secure prisons in England. The name Strangeways is older than the prison by centuries. The D. Strangeways family owned the land from at least 1306 when it appeared in records as Strongways. A great house, Strangeways Hall, stood here for centuries before it was demolished to build the prison in the Victorian era. From the 1990s through the 2010s, Great Ducie Street and the web of side streets surrounding the prison earned a reputation as the counterfeit capital of Europe. Hundreds of shops operating directly in the shadow of the prison wall openly sold fake designer goods, counterfeit pharmaceuticals, and pirated media. Police repeatedly raided the area. The shops reopened. The contradiction of a vast black market running within eyeshot of a maximum security prison was not lost on anyone. The proximity seemed to bother neither the traders nor the prison authorities particularly. Police Operation Vulcan eventually made serious inroads, and by the 2020s, enforcement had reduced the trade dramatically. As of 2026, the Manchester Evening News describes Great Ducie Street as undergoing quiet regeneration, coming to life behind its shutters after years when it functioned essentially as a ghost town. A major regeneration scheme, one of the most ambitious in northern England, is now planned for the area. Strangeways Hall has been gone for over a century. The counterfeit street is winding down. What this place becomes next is still being decided. Number 3 is a set of streets that also no longer exist. But unlike Little Island, this one was destroyed on purpose in living memory by the government that built it. In Hulme, south of Manchester city centre, 4 massive deck-access housing blocks were built between 1969 and 1972 as part of a modernist urban vision. The Hulme Crescents were named after Georgian street patterns they were meant to reference. They were enormous concrete structures designed with internal walkways that were officially called streets in the sky. The concept fell apart almost immediately. The blocks had chronic structural problems and persistent damp throughout. Lifts did not reach at every level. The internal walkways, the streets in the sky that were supposed to foster community, became no-go zones at night as crime and drug use concentrated on the elevated, enclosed decks. By the 1980s, official reports were calling the Hulme Crescents Europe's worst estate. In 1991, the government committed £31 million to resolve the problem. The decision was to demolish the entire complex, and the work was done between 1993 and 1994. 3 acres of open fields in Hulme now mark the footprint of where the block stood. Local residents say the grass tells you exactly where the walls were. The addresses that once existed, streets in the sky with real postcodes and real tenants, have vanished so completely that there is no physical trace at street level that anything was ever there. The blocks came down, the concept was abandoned, and the streets that only ever existed a few floors above the ground vanished with them. Number 2, Angel Meadow is a park. It is a place where what was there before has not been completely removed. This one was not cleared. It is still there, you just cannot see it without digging. It sits to the north of Manchester city centre, in an area now marketed as the Green Quarter. It has benches and paths and grass, and children play on it on ordinary afternoons. Walk through it without knowing what it is, and you would notice nothing unusual. What you would not know is that you are walking on top of approximately 40,000 human remains. Angel Meadow was one of the worst slums in Victorian Britain. Friedrich Engels, who walked through it in the 1840s, described it as among the most horrific places he had seen in Europe. At its peak, more than 30,000 people lived in streets designed for a fraction of that number, with entire families sharing single rooms. Cholera and typhus were not occasional crises in Angel Meadow. They were the baseline conditions of life there. The name is almost unbearably ironic. Angel Meadow was an existing burial ground before the slum grew up around it. As the population exploded and the death rate climbed, the cemetery overflowed. Bodies were buried in layers, packed into the earth in some areas, multiple remains deep. The ground level of the meadow rose visibly over decades as the population of the dead accumulated beneath it. When the slum was eventually cleared through the 19th and early 20th centuries, the street names disappeared. The park was laid over the site. In 2013, archaeologists digging foundations for the new co-op building at the edge of the site uncovered human remains that had not been disturbed since the Victorian era. Historian Dean Kirby, who wrote Angel Meadow, Victorian Britain's Most Savage Slum, has documented that those remains are still there, under the park benches and under the paths where people walk every day. There is no public marker for most of them. The park gives no indication at all that the ground beneath it holds anyone. On the 15th of June 1996, at approximately 9:20 in the morning, 2 men parked a Ford cargo van on Corporation Street in central Manchester, between the Marks and Spencer store and the Arndale shopping centre. At 9:45, they made a coded phone call to warn that a bomb was in the van. The device weighed 1,500 kilograms. It was the largest bomb detonated on the British mainland since the Second World War. What followed was one of the largest peacetime evacuations in British history. Police had roughly 90 minutes. They cleared 75,000 people from an area of the city centre packed with Saturday morning shoppers. The bomb went off at 11:17. The blast wave shattered windows across a radius of 1 kilometre, and approximately 200 people were injured. The Arndale shopping centre took the full force of the explosion. Nobody died. The only reason nobody died is that the IRA chose to warn. The devastation was planned and deliberate. carried out in public view on a busy high street on a Saturday morning. Corporation Street was sealed. The cordoned-off area was closed to the public for weeks afterward. Entire sections of the city centre simply not accessible. £700 million of damage was done in under 90 seconds. In the years that followed, the rebuilding triggered over £1 billion in investment in Manchester city centre. The bombing is credited with accelerating the transformation of the city in a way nothing else could have. Corporation Street has been rebuilt. The street you can walk down now is a post-1996 construction, designed in the late 1990s and built on the ground where the bomb wave cleared everything. Look carefully and you can see the architectural join, older buildings on one side of the street, the post-bomb redevelopment on the other. A line in the fabric of the city where one version of Manchester ended and another was forced to begin. The IRA planted that bomb in the knowledge that the blast would change the street permanently. They were right. It did. The street that existed on the morning of the 15th is gone. What stands now is what was built from the wreckage, and it has been standing for 30 years. Every city in Britain has a version of this list. Streets that no longer exist. Places the map has quietly stopped showing. Histories buried under new construction. If you want to see what the same kind of digging turns up somewhere else, subscribe. We have a lot more of this coming.